That's why.
I can hear it.
I don't know.
If you could turn to page 97 and 98 in the Gold Prayer Book. Sajipaki chukshing metog ingshi nidegen padi sangye jingdu mikte uwa idro kunam dag jingla chuparsho jetsun lama dampa kenam kichu kukala kense chutin trik jitar zampe dulce tinma lazab gechuki charpavab tu sol idam guru ratnamandala kam niryatayami.
There we go. I can't get my speaker to shut off. My volume's all of it. Let's turn this off. Is that better? No, that's coming through there again. Testing. And I've got the volume all the way down, and it's still coming out of the computer. Testing, testing. Wow, that did it. Okay. Yay. We'll have to keep the setting there for the future. I got to find my cursor again. There it is. Okay. So let's do the refuge prayer while we're at it. If I need to stop my screen share, then I'm not sure. Oh, okay. Let's hope before then.
Okay, if you're in the
Yeah.
Kadampa, it's page 34.
Except we'll change this third line to by my practice of listening to the Dharma instead of giving in other perfections. Okay. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I be, I'm sorry, I did it spaced out. By my practice of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good enough. Okay, now we can start. Let's just do a very short meditation, give ourselves a chance to come into this space and focus our minds, and then also to set our motivation, our intention for being here. So Just spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath. I don't think I need to give anyone instruction, but just tune into the breath whatever way suits your mind. Try to keeping the mind present with the breath. Whenever you see the mind has wandered, then just gently guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I will lead you in a short reflection so we can set our motivation. So before we set our motivation, I thought it might be nice to do a short reflection on this topic of aging that we're going to be discussing tonight. Maybe go back to in your childhood when you first became aware of the idea of aging, the age of your parents, the fact that you were aging, and just what were your attitudes towards aging at that time? And then maybe jump forward to when you were in school, elementary, grade school. Again, what were your attitudes towards aging? What did you think of that in general for yourself as well as observing others? And then jump forward to teenage years. Again, that's quite a decade, but nonetheless, choose some period of time in your teenage years and your attitudes towards aging then. And then your adult years, when you first began out in the working world, what have you. What were your attitudes towards aging at that time? And then for those of you who feel like you've reached some sort of midlife, then what were your attitudes around aging at that point? And then come forward to this moment now. In your life right now, what are your thoughts about aging? Whatever your age is currently, have some attitudes, I'm sure, about this topic. And just reflect on those. As we'll be discussing tonight, aging is a reality for all of us, for all beings. Part of the topic of impermanence, change, constantly happening moment by moment. And we can see it's a source of a lot of difficulty and suffering, but we can also see it as an opportunity. So set a very positive motivation for being here tonight, thinking that you're here to examine this topic of aging, to develop more conscious awareness around this process that we're all dealing with throughout every aspect of our lives, every time of our lives, continually aging. And we're going to do this so we can increase our own positive states of mind, our own ability to use this life meaningfully while we have it, and to help others to do the same, to have a deeper awareness of the realities of life, especially aging, so they too can make best use of the life that they have. And think that it's for this reason that we're here tonight. So welcome, and I'm very happy to be back here at Kadampa Center. I took a look at when I was last here, I think it was 5 years ago, in 2018, bit before the pandemic. So I'm glad you all survived, that you're all still here. And I survived, so I'm here. But this topic of conscious aging, I've been teaching on this for a while, and it's kind of interesting. I don't think I've taught on it for some time. I think the last time, well, it was probably for Tupten Kungaling down in Florida. Not sure when that was. Maybe it was even an online teaching I did over the pandemic. But every time I visit this topic, of course, I'm older, so it becomes more and more relevant. It's going to be scary at some point, I'm sure. But so this topic, again, is one that's relevant to all of us. It certainly is something that we do all grapple with, particularly as we reach what we tend to call old age. I want to try to gear the conversation tonight and the things I'm presenting to the whole gamut of aging. It's interesting in Tibetan Buddhism when we talk about the wheel of life and you go into those last two links. The last two links are birth, which is conception, and then aging and death, because they say aging starts the very next moment after conception. So in a way, aging is a continual process that we all deal with, but it becomes a little more problematic, right, when we start getting into those upper years. My dear mother just turned 93 this year, and she's hanging in there and doing all right, but it's interesting to watch her going through these changes and to see that as potentially where I could be as well in some years. So what I'd like to do to kind of give some kind of guidance as to what I mean by this topic of conscious aging. What does it mean to age consciously? Oop, I've got to get it on my screen. How come it's not on my screen? Yeah, it's kind of strange. Got technical issues tonight. It's so weird. I keep losing my cursor. It's like, where in the heck is it? There it is. It's weird. I'm not getting it at all. Let me stop sharing and try to pull it up on another thing here. Maybe this one will bring it up. I'm not getting it still. Maybe this one? Yeah, I think that'll do it. I think if I can change the screen. Ah, success. All right. What do we mean by conscious aging? This is a little description I put together based on a few books that I'm going to cite tonight. There are some people out there who have written on this topic, which is useful. That's when I first got my inspiration to do this, was reading a book by Lewis Richman called Aging as a Spiritual Practice. And this is what I'd use as a description for this: the process of utilizing the natural process of growing older as an opportunity for spiritual growth through cultivating wisdom and awareness, and thus a means to make all phases of our lives fulfilling and meaningful. Sound good? Why not? Let's do it. Okay, so again, the whole point of this is so that we use, especially as we start growing older in those, that part of our life, for more meaningful endeavors. But we'll be exploring this from a number of vantage points. Now, in Lewis Richman's book, I think he divides it into kind of 4 phases, but to me, the middle 2 phases kind of blended into one a little bit more. And so I'm just calling this kind of 3 steps that I think are necessary for us to get to a point of conscious aging. How is it that we actually reach the conclusion that we have to use that process in a very meaningful way, as opposed to just either neglecting it, kind of hiding our head in the sand and thinking we're not aging at all, or becoming terrified at the fact that our bodies are aging in this way. So the first step is to become aware of the reality of aging. Then we're going to go on to talk about how we move beyond just that mere awareness to a fuller acceptance of the reality of aging. And then the third is to go beyond mere acceptance to genuine growth and appreciation of the reality of aging. So this is kind of the steps we're going to make to kind of become more and more aware of the usefulness of working with our mortality. I'm sorry, not mortality, our aging. Mortality is a part of it too, though. We'll get there. So I'd like to start by going through just kind of 3 points that get us into this understanding of what I mean by becoming aware of the reality of aging. It's just not knowing that we age, because obviously if we go back to that analysis we did when we did the meditation, all of us have some awareness of aging, right? When you are quite young, you're very excited to age, actually, probably. You want to get older. You don't want to be a little kid anymore. You want to have everything that you see the adults having and so on. And then, of course, at some point you start to question that and what have you. But so it's not that we're not aware of aging, because we're aware of the fact of it for quite some time. But does the import of it hit you? This is what we're going to be exploring. So in terms of the first topic, the Buddha's experience with aging, I think most of you know the story of the Buddha and as Prince Siddhartha, and the fact that his father, King Shuddhodana, was trying to keep him from seeing the outside world and the reality of the suffering of the world. And so he kept him in the palace grounds and tried to do everything to make that seem like a beautiful, idyllic paradise. And it was only when he became curious, because a traveling minstrel had come through and talked about all these places in the world, the young prince wanted to actually go out and see these places. And so he kept bugging his father, well, can't I go out? Can't I leave the palace? And eventually his father gave in to him, but he set everything up in this town so that it would look so pristine that he would think there's no difference between being at the palace and being in these outside places. But as you know from the story, he went out 3 times initially and saw someone who was ill, someone who was aging, and then saw a funeral, what do they call it, like a procession, thank you, funeral procession that was leading the body to the funeral pyre to be burned and what have you. And of course, aging plays a role in that. When he saw someone who was decrepit, who was quite old, he asked his charioteer, Chana, he said, what is this? I've never seen this before. It's kind of hard to believe he didn't see an old person, but it's the way the story goes. So, and Chana said, this is aging. This is old age. And he goes, wow, that looks really heavy duty. And he says, well, does this happen to everyone? And he says, yes, this will happen to you. This happens to all of us. And of course, the same for illness, the same for death. And then on his 4th trip out, he finally saw the spiritual mendicant that was trying to figure out the way out of all of this. And that's why the Buddha, as Prince Siddhartha, took his spiritual path and discovered the means to attaining liberation and enlightenment. So again, this is showing already that this is one of the big 3. you know. Illness, aging, and death are the three main things. Of course, in the sutras of the Buddha, he often adds on birth, you know, but we forget what birth is all about. But birth is supposedly a very, very painful process that we go through. We don't remember, thankfully. You know? So these are the really big ones that you know, the Buddha himself is showing that we need to pay some attention to. They're kind of pointing out a reality of life that indicates the suffering nature of our existence. Then I want to talk, in the second thing that was on the slide before was my own experience with aging, which I think is kind of, I don't know, maybe it's not worth sharing, but I'll share a few things. I didn't really have much contact with my grandparents when I was quite young because my father was in the army, so we moved around quite a bit. I was actually born in France, and then we went to Williamsburg, West Virginia, or Williamsburg, Virginia, and then we went to Heidelberg, Germany, and then we went to Indianapolis, and then we ended up in St. Louis, where I mostly, you know, grew up. From there, I was about 9, 10 years old, and that's when I first started to see my grandparents. And they both lived in Wisconsin, where my parents were from, actually very close to each other. And I remember that we would go to see my father's parents, and all my memories of my father's parents are in black and white. I have this like view of, it's kind of like these old pictures of like the Depression age or something, of these worn faces. And in that household, children were meant to be seen and not heard, you know, and we'd have to like stay in another room and do our playing very quietly while my parents visited with my grandparents. And I hated it. You know, I was like, who are these old people and why do we have to deal with them? You know, and then we'd go to see my mother's grandparents, and we'd often would stay with them, which I liked, you know, and all my memories there are living color, right? You know, it's, everything was very vibrant. They were really delightful, wonderful people, and very, you know, laughing, and they loved to have us on their lap. And you know, my grandfather would sit me on his knee, and, you know, just, it was all this wonderful stuff, very warm. And unfortunately, I mean, didn't get a chance to really experience whether my father's parents were truly like that. They passed away shortly after that. They were quite, their health was really challenged. But anyway, that's kind of my first understanding that there's kind of different ways to do this. I mean, if you see these people who have reached that level of age, that not everybody does it the same way. Some people are actually, you know, very bitter about all of that perhaps and had a really hard life, and other people are quite joyous in spite of the fact that they're the same age. Then, of course, I had other experiences with kind of the reality of aging. See all my gray hair. I actually had gray hair kind of on the sides here in high school. And so gray hair came in time, you know, and when I went away to the master's program in Italy, it was quite interesting. I was turned 40 in my first year there. And there were two women from, one was from Japan, one was from Singapore. And they were both like 25 or something. And when they asked me, I said, it's your birthday today, how old are you? And I said, oh, I'm 40. And they said, we thought you were our age. And I'm like, oh, no, you're crazy. I mean, I'm not 15 years younger. I mean, maybe I could be in my 30s, you know, 30-ish, but 25, I mean, my gosh. Then after the master's program, I get home and I went to one of our local grocery stores that had a senior Tuesday. You know, they gave everyone a discount if you were over 65, I guess, 62. I don't remember what the age was, 62, I think. And at that time, I'm 47. And they gave me the discount. And I was like, you guys got it all wrong, you know. So I like get this confusion of like some people thinking I'm 15 years younger, some I'm thinking I'm 15 years older. I mean, that's a pretty, maybe you've had that same experience, but and they always have that thing of you're only as old as you feel, but I think that's a bit of a delusion too. These bodies are aging, that's a reality. So I don't know, I've had a strange relationship around aging, and sometimes feeling again that I was quite younger than I looked and sometimes quite older than I looked, but I don't know, I don't claim to have any great insights from some of these experiences, but I think it has helped me to maybe question the reality of kind of what is aging and how are we dealing with that process. We're going to get into kind of an examination of when we generate that awareness in this first part. When is it that it really hits home? I think Venerable Rabina would say when the penny drops or something like that. That's a British phrase, I suppose. We're going to look at a phrase that Louis Richmond has, when lightning strikes, when you kind of get that aha moment and you realize that, this is happening to me. And it's happening to me and won't stop happening to me. Maybe one other thing that I'll share is when I was at a family reunion up in Wisconsin, and this was on my mother's side of the family. And my mother is kind of the matriarch of the family now because her parents passed away quite a long time ago. And she still has pretty much all of her siblings except her oldest brother who passed away some time ago. But we're at the family reunion, and I realized that, the last family reunion I was at, because we don't do these that often, I was the kids running around, doing all these things. And now it's like I'm the older person that's kind of being ignored by all the little kids, just like I ignored all the older people. And so, I'm sure you've had similar experiences. I am curious to see if anything came up for you in the meditation when we looked at kind of attitudes towards aging as we were aging in that meditation. Did anything come up for anybody?
And if you're here in the Kadampa, we will bring a microphone around. Laura's got it. And if you are online on Zoom, you can do the little raise your hand or just get my attention. If you're on YouTube, you can put it in the chat and I'll relay that.
Wow.
And
Lots
for
of
those
options.
of us in the Kadampa, I'm sorry this keeps blinking on and off. This is the screen, but usually after it's warmed up, it stops, but it hasn't yet. So just use that as your practice. Okay.
So any comments that anyone wants to share? Yeah, please, Julia.
I remember thinking,
Hold it close.
when I was in my 30s and my parents were in, 50s, 60s, and I would go to the house and I went, look what they're watching on Saturday night. Oh my goodness. Well, and then they're not doing anything. They're not going out. And then now that's where I am,
Yeah. Yeah. I have this image of like, we're all like on this plank that we're walking towards falling off the plank, now we say we're a little closer to the edge. Everyone else in the front of us keeps falling off, but, and it is interesting to look, back at times when we saw those folks as being quite old. I mean, even when we were in our 20s and people in their 40s seem old, right? 40s, my gosh.
I'll share something that came up for me. I'm 55 and live with my 82-year-old mom, and it struck me that I feel like when it comes to Dharma practice, I am desperately running out of time. But at this age, it's a very busy time in,
Sure.
in life. So, yeah, that's all.
Yeah. No, it's and it is that is the big gist of all this, is that if we start seeing the reality of aging as indicating that there is a clock ticking in terms of how much time we have to practice Dharma, obviously that's the big import of all of this. And you can get that at a very young age. You can get it, quite early if you wake up to that reality. That's why I'm hoping that some listening to this that are quite younger get the fact that this is happening to you and use this life well, especially knowing that death can also happen at any time. We have young people that die, old people that die, everyone in the middle that dies. So, don't think that you've got forever. And I keep telling people especially when I do see young people at teachings, practice now, folks, because it doesn't get easier when you get older. This body, it's looking all of it 65 years and feeling all of it 65 years. We have someone online, Manisha.
Manisha, yeah, go ahead and unmute.
Hi, I am really looking forward to this topic because I guess I am in midlife for 10 years now, in a sense. I think until 39, I never even thought what aging was all about. When you were going through the meditation, what did you feel at this age and that? I was like, I never even thought about it, but I think something happened, and then it's been 10 years because, okay, let me put it this way, that we were trying to adopt a child, and that phase of life where I was like, oh, can I do this? Is it in my capacity? And I always got disillusioned or like illusioned that, oh, I have the strength to do it. So here now I'm 47 And for some reason, it didn't work out.
Mm.
Last year, we haven't given up the case altogether. Like, with the agency, I'm just tired of it, waiting for 3 years. And my husband is 61 now, you see? So like, what's aging here? And also I live in a very old neighborhood. So everybody's around in the 80s. So I don't feel young anymore. But I work in a school, so I feel young there. So, it's so, I can't explain. Sometimes the environment does it to you that you feel younger, but also you're like, and I hear somebody saying the clock ticking. It happened to me, but until I caught my breath every morning in the Sangha meeting, I felt better, and I was like, oh, I can do this.
Yeah.
I am in that. I'm really looking forward to what am I going to get out of it, because I feel I can put my mind to rest, Does that make sense?
Okay, good. Thanks for sharing that, Manisha. Yeah, it is interesting. The whole prospect of, what can you handle at a particular age? Can you handle having a child and all of what's involved in that? And I see people like some of these movie stars, like Robert De Niro, I think just had a baby with his young wife. I mean, it's a little strange, like when you're you're pretty close to the exit door, and you're bringing someone else in the entrance, and it's like, what does that really mean? I don't know. It's a little strange, but I think we each have to make these judgments about where we're at and what we can handle. And it's an interesting part of aging. Yeah, Renee.
So definitely the outlook on aging, I can relate to what you said, and the thing about, that some of the things my mom used to do, now I'm that way, that type of thing.
Uh-huh.
So there's been changes over time, but I remember my father saying, he'd look in the mirror and who was this old man looking back at me? And, he was not spiritual at all, but when you think of that in a more spiritual way, it's really kind of quite profound that the body, this is just a vehicle.
Right. Just kind of a shell that, our minds are in, and it goes through its own process. But again, our minds feel kind of timeless in some ways. We don't have the aging of the mind. It's the aging of the body that we're sort of adjusting to in our minds. But yeah, it is quite interesting. Let's look at a few things in regard to all of this. And the third point that was on the screen just a short while ago, still up on the screen here, is that aging being a part of reality. Of course, this goes to the teaching that the Buddha gave on impermanence. Impermanence can have kind of different shades. We can talk about the gross impermanence, which is when things go out of existence, which, as I said, is a part of the relevance of aging, is that aging just doesn't keep going on forever. Aging ends in death. We end up having to leave this life behind. This is the grosser form of impermanence. But then, of course, it's the change that is happening momentarily. That is the subtler form of impermanence that is manifesting in the terms of this body continually aging. That's kind of the reality of all things that are produced, is that they don't stay the same for a moment. And many things, again, do go through a process of reaching some sort of peak and then degenerating and eventually going out of existence. So the Buddha, was very adamant about us understanding that and working within the acceptance of that. Because otherwise, if we keep railing against it as if it isn't happening, then we're the ones deluding ourselves in terms of that, and need to be open to that reality. So I don't want to say too much more about that in terms of that particular topic, but I think we can look at the ways that the Buddha has approached this topic. For this, I'm going to actually share from Larry Rosenberg's his book, which is called Living in the Light of Death. And what he is doing is kind of recounting a teaching of the Buddha that is called the Five Contemplations. We don't use this in Tibetan Buddhism, and I like sharing sometimes things from other Buddhist traditions, so we kind of open our eyes to how people from Theravadan traditions might practice. I think Larry Rosenberg does have a lot of connection to Insight Meditation Society, IMS, and that tradition. But I think he also has some Zen. Louis Richmond has the Zen connections. He was a student of Suzuki Roshi's. But anyway, Larry Rosenberg cites this wonderful contemplation that I guess they use in the Theravadan tradition to wake up to reality. He says the Buddha left us 5 contemplations, which he advised us to reflect on frequently. I am subject to aging. Aging is unavoidable. I am subject to illness. Illness is unavoidable. I am subject to death. Death is unavoidable. Number 4, I will grow different, separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. The kind of speaking to the whole process that, there will be a change. Things will eventually get to a place where we have to separate from everything that is dear from us. And the number 5 is an interesting one. I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and live dependent on my actions. Whatever I do, for good or for ill, to that will I fall heir. Of course, this is speaking to karma, kind of this underwriting principle that is guiding the whole process, that is causing us to be born into these human bodies that have this capacity to age, get ill, and so on, and eventually die. And this is the underlying force that is propelling us through whatever our life experiences are. Some people dying quite early, some people dying much later, and so on. But that's because all of the actions we commit are part of our legacy then that we carry forward into our future lives and continue to experience the effects of. So aging is definitely one of the biggies, again, and part of these contemplations that if we wake up every day kind of reminding ourselves of that. Lama Zopa was always quite keen on reminding ourselves of mortality. I think that's a good one, certainly, to get our heads around, because obviously, again, we don't know when death will come. Death may come at any time. It's completely uncertain. So if we have that awareness that this can happen, then we are much more likely to be prepared. Not that we're necessarily going to be prepared. We have to do the work. But we don't live our lives kind of thinking that somehow it isn't going to happen. Now, when in talking about this, I thought I'd share this because I thought this was very cute. Larry Rosenberg says, this isn't the cheeriest set of reflections in the world. And most people, when they first hear them, do feel some resistance. They don't mind contemplating the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence in the world around them, but this is getting a little close to home, right? This is saying, okay, I got to take this concept of impermanence, not look at, flowers wilting and things like that. Look at my own reality. Look at what's happening to me. And that's the big thing for tonight, is to think that this is something to think about in terms of yourself. Yes, you see others around you aging. Yes, we see if your parents are still there, you see them aging, you see your children aging, see your friends aging, all of that. But seeing their aging can be a reminder to look at your own aging, but really it hits home when we do look at our own, when we do become aware of that and accept that. So what is being asked of us, he says, as meditators, is to come face to face with the law of impermanence in an intimate way. Of course, his book tends to dwell mostly on the subject of death, but again, they're all right there as part of that continuum, from birth through aging that begins with illness happening at various times, and then the ending of death that we all have to deal with. So this is obviously a big topic to meditate on and something that we need to have a deeper awareness of. And to that end, I share a nice little quote, from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. In the garden of gentle sanity, may you be bombarded by coconuts of wakefulness, not wokeness, wakefulness. But wokeness, get bombarded by those too. But this is kind of what we're hoping, is that we kind of get these coconuts being thrown at us that wake us up to this reality. Because if you wake up a little too late, well, then you've just missed some time. You can still use it. It's never too late in terms of being able to wake up to the realities of existence. But we want those coconuts to bombard us as early as possible so that we can actually do the work that we need to do, actually devote our lives to more sane practices of Dharma and what have you, rather than just getting caught up in all of the garbage. To this, I mentioned this briefly earlier, what Lewis Richman, sorry, they both have similar names, Lewis Richman, who wrote the book Aging as a Spiritual Practice, he describes this as lightning strikes. So he says one way to describe this experience of awakening to the reality of aging is lightning strikes. And he tells a story about his father to illustrate this. I'm going to share this story because I think it's a nice story. Let me get it up on my tablet here. It'll just take a second. He had a father who came to him at one point, and this is kind of the story of that experience. He says, once when I was about 12, my father came into my room holding a book. He was in his 40s at the time, and he says, I want to show you something. The book was an autobiography of the poet Robert Graves, who also did a lot of work with Greek mythology and things. You might recall him. I think he did with The Golden Bough, I think was the book that he wrote. And his father apparently was quite an avid, studied Greek mythology and history and what have you. So on the front cover was a photograph of Graves as a young man. They often put that on a biography, right? The young person, because they don't want to show them in their old age necessarily. So you've got Robert Graves being black-haired, handsome, full of vitality and hope. My father turned the book over to show a photograph of the present-day Graves, hair white, face wrinkled, eyes shrouded in sorrow. Look at this, my father said, turning the book over and over, showing me the startling transformation of youth to old age and back again. You can't understand this, he said. He dropped the book on my bed, and just as suddenly as he had come into my room, he turned and left. I had not said anything. I sensed my father's awkwardness and the poignancy of his effort, but he was right. I didn't really understand. Now at 64, he says, when he was writing this book, I do understand and thank my father for his long ago effort. The old understand the young better than the other way round. My father wanted to reach out across the gulf, separating age from youth, and tap me with the magic wand of his hard-won knowledge, but he couldn't. He could only show me the two photographs and wish the best for me as I set off on the journey to adulthood. And so again, he goes on to say this wasn't necessarily his lightning strikes moment, but if he had gotten it then, it would have been. I think he said his lightning strikes moment came when he was diagnosed with cancer, and he had to look at the reality of death and then understand that, again, death is just the end of this continuum of aging, and having recovered from that, how he looked at the rest of his life unfolding before him then. But I think each of us, hopefully, has had our lightning strikes moment or some moment where we actually go, okay, this is happening to me now. Not just in an intellectual way, but you get it at a very deep level. Becomes life transforming, becomes something that actually becomes the impetus to change things. Kind of the subtitle for this session tonight of Conscious Aging is enjoying the gifts of getting older, growing older. And that's what we're going to be moving to eventually in that third part, is kind of identifying what are these gifts, because sometimes it doesn't seem like there's many gifts. It's like, what, you're throwing that at me now, rather than, oh, I get to experience this. I get to have, another kind of epiphany of sorts and wake up to deeper awareness. So this is the idea of this lightning strikes. He describes it as the moment we truly wake up to our aging and can see the full significance of it in our whole life, from its unremembered beginning, the beginning when we're born, that thankfully, as I said, we don't remember, to its unknown end, right? None of us know when we're going to die. We actually had a little discussion at Elise and David's, I think it was last night over dinner, whether we'd want to know our date of death. Would you like to know your date of death, or wouldn't you? Think about it. I won't ask you now. But, there's kind of pros and cons to both. But most of us, of course, don't know. And even sometimes when people are diagnosed with something that looks like it could be their end, they recover from that and they die many years later. So until that moment, until we have a lightning strikes moment, regardless of our age, we spend much of the time not thinking too much about where our life is headed or what it all means. And I can say for me, some of it came to some degree when I experienced the death of my first partner back in 1992. I can't say it was as much of a conscious awareness around aging, but it was certainly around death. And I had no spiritual path to lean on at that time. That's when I found Tibetan Buddhism, actually. I started reading Sogyal Rinpoche's Tibetan Book of Living and Dying that came out that year. And in 1993, I went on retreat with Sogyal Rinpoche, took refuge with him, started my Buddhist path, and then met FPMT and Rinpoche just a few years later. And so I think, again, for many of us, we've come to the Buddhist path out of some sort of shift in our awareness, that suddenly the ground was out from underneath us and we needed something to rely upon, So this is, again, I think a commonality for many people, not to say that if you came to Buddhism through some other avenue that you missed something, but this lightning strikes moment can still happen for any of us if you haven't had it yet. But I think perhaps many people in the room have had it. I see some nodding heads as I'm kind of looking around, because it does shake you up and it does cause you to question your priorities and, do all sorts of things to decide that you're going to do something different with this life, and hopefully something more meaningful, purposeful. He says, but once lightning strikes, then it's different. We have reached a tipping point. We have stopped seeing things as we wished they were, and for a moment at least, we can see them as they actually are. Get that this is going to happen to me. In fact, that was one of the interesting things when Venerable Rabina was visiting. And actually, she wasn't visiting at that time. That's right, we were doing a retreat. I think it was with Geshe Sherab in Santa Fe. And we got word that one of the students had died who was a student of Venerable Rabina's. And so I sent her an email saying, if you could please include her in your prayers and so on. And when Venerable Rabina wrote back to me, and she says, whenever I hear this news, all I can think is, someday that's going to be me. Someday your name is going to be the one being sent around on the email, and people are going to be remarking on Facebook, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that that person died, and da-da-da-da, and all the things that go on. You'll be that person. You'll be that person, in terms of, or you are that person now in terms of your aging. You are the one that is going through this process. You are the one that is, if you live that long, going to end up in old age. I don't know if I'll live as long as my mom. Maybe. We'll see. But, we are on that same pathway that every other human being has traveled before. There's absolutely no difference. The only difference, again, is what are we going to do with that reality? That's kind of getting us into the second part where we say, okay, I become aware, I have my lightning strikes moment. Well, then how do I really kind of use that in terms of having a deeper acceptance of it? Moving beyond mere awareness to a fuller acceptance of the reality of aging. So here, let me take it off screen because I don't really want to go to that yet. And in fact, I'll go back so that you don't get distracted by the screen here in the Gampa. This kind of leads me into a teaching that is in Larry Rosenberg's book that I do hear of in the, it comes from one of the Pali Sutras, which again are the main sutras that are studied by the Theravadan tradition. I think most of you know the Mahayana tradition is more out of the Sanskrit sutras, and then the Theravadan tradition seems to rely primarily on the Pali canon. I think most of the Pali canon has been translated into English by this wonderful monk, Bhikkhu Bodhi, and it's worth reading some of the sutras, but apparently there's one sutra that's called the Salata Sutra. The Salata Sutra, they call it Sutta in the Pali, it's not Sutra. Sutta, Salata means arrow, the arrow sutra. And in this sutra, it's quite interesting, the Buddha talks about how there is a first arrow that we all experience. And in this case, we're going to talk about that first arrow being aging. Of course, that first arrow can be illness. That first arrow can be any of the myriad numbers of sufferings that we all experience in the course of a life that we don't have much control over, right? That first arrow comes in from seemingly nowhere. Of course, it's a product of our karma. It's a product of the bodies that we've created through our karma. And we don't have any real say in that arrow. That arrow is going to pierce you whether you want it to or not, right? That pain you're going to experience. We have a second arrow, though, in this sutra that he teaches, which is the arrow that we then pierce ourselves with on the basis of that experience. So when we feel the pain of aging, then we go, oh, this is so horrible, and then we start complaining to all our friends and everything, and we can't stand the fact that this is happening to me, and oh, look at the wrinkles on my face, and all this stuff, and look at our culture and how much it tries to wash over all of that. Remember, there was a wonderful scene. I know Woody Allen isn't the best graces these days, but his film Manhattan, where he and Muriel Hemingway are watching television, and it's one of these old-time movies with an aging movie star or something, and she's talking about the old faces, and I think Woody Allen says something like, yeah, old faces are beautiful, and they're really, and you don't hear that, right? People want to get rid of the old faces. That's a first arrow that we then create a second arrow around. We torture ourselves and put ourselves through so much unnecessary suffering because of the first arrow. Well, why do that? Again, get rid of the second arrow. Eventually, the Buddha says you can get rid of the first arrow, but we don't have the ability to do that yet. We can't stop all of that happening. So instead, we're going to just get rid of the second arrow and replace it with Again, we turn these arrows into flowers. We can say we're going to change it into a flower. We're going to change this into something that actually gives greater impetus to our practice. So don't be bothered by the suffering of aging. Suffering of aging is going to happen. We're going to have to deal with all of what happens as this body ceases to function in the way that it used to, and we can't do the things that we want to, and we have to get a walker. My mom's got her walker that she goes everywhere with, right? You know, all of those things that we don't like doing, that's going to happen. That's first arrow stuff. The second arrow is completely optional, and we can choose to have a different experience. That's what we want to drive towards. Now, what I want to do here, again, I'm finding this when I was doing the research on this, that there was much more kind of appealing stuff, perhaps, in the Pali tradition. They have a couple of words that they work with in Pali. Again, I don't know what these would be in Sanskrit. We often tend to focus a lot of things around renunciation, which is kind of akin to samvega, but not exactly the same thing. We have this thing called samvega that is known as kind of being the urgent need to practice that can grow out of heightened sense of the perishable nature of life. It can include a real feeling of shock, and a sense not only that life doesn't last forever, but also that the way we have been living is wrong. This is how Larry Rosenberg describes this. We don't really have an exact word for this that we've used in Tibetan Buddhism that I could find, but it's kind of that beginning of the process of renunciation, when we wake up to the reality that we have to do something different. That what we've been doing so far and how we've been going about living isn't leading to the results that we really want, isn't helping us to contend with the challenges of life in a much more positive way. As he says here, the way we've been living is wrong. That sounds a bit judgmental, but we just have not been doing what we needed to do to move in a more positive direction. But everyone in their own time, don't beat yourself up if you feel like, oh my God, I haven't had my lightning strikes moment. Maybe I'll have it tonight, listening to this talk. Well, that's fine. At least you're getting it. It all happens when it needs to. But whenever we get that moment, we kind of feel like, oh, I really need to change things now. Again, I can say that that was a good part of what came up for me when I was confronting my partner's mortality and looking at the issue of, how do I make sense of life? How do I work with the reality of death? And Sogyo Rinpoche's book was really quite informative in giving me a structure to be able to make some positive changes in my life. And many of you, again, have gone through the same process whenever it was that you came to Buddhism and began your spiritual path. So we need a kind of samvega experience to come out of that lightning strikes. Because you can have lightning strikes and then get really, really depressed, right? That's the second arrow stuff, right? Where you're just like, you don't want to even look in the mirror anymore because you're just frightened of what's going to happen as your body ages and so on. So some people get the lightning strikes moment, but they don't get a spiritual awakening. There's no epiphany there. There's just simply that reality that now is staring them in the face. I think a lot of people, when they come to Buddhist centers and they see, teachings on death and dying, they think, my God, how morbid, how ridiculous. I don't want to think about that. We need to think about that. Going back to those 5 contemplations, this is grist for the mill. This is something to wake us up to that reality. They do say that in some realms of existence, you kind of do have a set number of years that you live. And then, people get very complacent in those realms, they say, because there's nothing like as an impetus to, put under your butt to get you going. You have that phrase, practice like your hair is on fire. Well, our hair is on fire, folks. We're moving in that direction. So for Samvega, he continues saying, it might turn our world upside down, sending us off to a whole new way of life. Even if it doesn't have so dramatic an effect, it can light a fire under our practice. We get much less caught up in power, prestige, money, lust, the acquisition of goods. I mean, look back on your life before you had that moment, those of you who felt like you have had this kind of huge shift in your life based on some awareness around death, aging, the reality of suffering that we all have to deal with. And look at how much you've left behind, where your priorities are now compared to where they were. Again, if you haven't done that, then it's good examining that from tonight's talk, is where are you putting all of your emphasis? What is it that you're putting your money on? Because all the things that we have in this life that are all these entertainments and pleasures, what people often call their bucket list that they want to do when they get old, right? I have to see that wonder of the world, and I have to get to this part of the world that I've always wanted to go. I mean, do those things do anything for you? Sometimes they can be really important experiences to be with other people, to grow and develop from kind of the human experience of that. But generally, they're things that we simply leave behind. They're memories that come and go, and that's it. Snapshots that we take, and then, there's nothing more to them, right? There's nothing that you take from this life that is relevant from those experiences. Whereas if you reorient your priorities to a spiritual path, that's what you'll take with you, of course. That's what you carry forward, is all of the work that you've done on your mind, to change your mind, develop your mind. So there's maybe one more slide on Samvega, I think, and then we go on to another wonderful concept from the Pali scriptures. Dharma teachings start to make real sense to us if that's the case, if we do see this shift in priorities, and we begin to live them instead of just assenting intellectually. Most times, we go to teach and we nod our head and we go, yeah, it makes so much sense. It's really great ideas. And then we just kind of leave here and it's like gone. And we just keep doing what we're doing. If you get this moment and you actually get this Samvega impulse, then you see, it's got to start sticking. This has got to start shifting me, changing me. Samvega, as it says here, leads to a conversion of the heart from an egocentric existence to a search for that which is timeless, vast, and sacred. This is where he talks about another concept that's very related, pasada. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the Pali right. Pasada might be translated as clear and serene confidence, a conviction that our situation isn't hopeless, that the practice of meditation can take us beyond sickness, aging, and death. That there's actually something that we can kind of put our trust in. Of course, for most of us, again, this has become the Buddhist path that shows us a way to transcend suffering. We've all studied the Four Noble Truths. Know that in the first truth, he's speaking to all of these realities of what we have to experience, the truth of dukkha, or suffering as it's often translated. The second truth, he's speaking to why we're in that state, the causes of that, our own karma and delusions that are at the root, and certainly the ignorance that's driving the whole show. And then we have the two other truths that speak to the reality that it doesn't have to be this way, that there's actually hope. Again, that we can open our eyes to a different way of working with the world and come to know the Buddhist path, that fourth noble truth, the true paths, and that leads to the third noble truth, the end of dukkha, once and for all. Again, so this is an important concept. Again, we talk about these things. I just have never heard terms for them in Tibetan Buddhism or in Sanskrit. But Samvega and Pasada, and I think it's nice to think of that as kind of separate stages. You wake up to the reality of things, but then you have to get to kind of this sense of, I have to do something different. And then you generate a conviction, a confidence in the path. I think this is how we're getting in this second step of generating what I call here a full acceptance. Again, I think Lewis Richmond divided it into two things. I think he called the one, I can't remember, acceptance, and the other one awareness or something, I can't remember. Got that already. Let's go to the next slide. The problem surrounding these phenomena is not external to us. It has everything to do with our cravings and attachments. Suffering is not a dead end, but a gateway to realization. The proper application of the practice of what, again, they practice the Eightfold Path. I think I taught that one of my previous trips here, the Eightfold Path. It's a way that in the Theravadan tradition, they approach the path to liberation. The proper application of the practice can turn the pain of sickness and death into the joy of liberation. When we have that pasada element, where we have confidence in the Buddha's teachings as being the way out, then we can practice it wholeheartedly and joyfully, because we know that we found it. We may not have the absolute conviction that we found it until later on, when perhaps we've had deeper realizations. But if at the level when we discover these teachings and we begin to investigate them, and we go, yeah, that's it. That's what I've been looking for. That's the way out. Then again, we've got this element of pasada. Then I want to share, somehow my cursor hit on that little forward key. A quote from Ajahn Lee that Larry Rosenberg shares. He says, aging, illness, and death are treasures for those who understand them. They're noble truths, noble treasures. If they were people, I'd bow down to their feet every day. So again, I'm talking mostly about aging tonight, but we can do the same investigation around illness, and certainly we do it around death in this tradition, to understand that these are actually gifts for us, to wake up to the reality of that happening, because it is happening. As we know, I said earlier, our death can happen at any moment. Death is a wonderful friend if we actually invite it in and become aware of it every single day. And you make your decisions throughout that day on the basis of that. And aging is the same thing. If we continue to be in this world and have the good fortune not to die, we're going to continue the process of aging. It won't go away. We'll just keep changing day by day. So now I call this third step, as I introduced when I kind of gave you the outline of what we're looking at in tonight's session, as going beyond acceptance to genuine growth and appreciation of the reality of aging, kind of making it into something that we can feel a real kind of that gift of it becomes reality for us because we start doing things in a different way. We start having different awareness around our life and how to live it. Now, again, certainly for many people, this does happen as part of the process of aging because we start going through a deeper questioning of life and what we are doing with our life. But I do think that here is where we will talk about some of what naturally occurs when this body does start to have difficulties and problems, and we can't necessarily do everything that we used to do, and the image of ourselves changes and all these various things. For this, I'm going to draw from a third book, which is really quite nice. Kathleen Dowling Singh, you may have heard of her. She is a wonderful writer. I first came across her with her first book that was, I think it was her first one, called The Grace in Dying. And then she has a book that she published of The Grace in Aging, and then went on to did a third in the series of the Grace in Living, I think. And so nonetheless, this Grace in Aging is a really wonderful book. And I'm drawing a bit from what she has there, but I'm going to talk about these mostly from my own kind of presentation of them. And some of them I've kind of put together, and I've added a few other things that she didn't have. I like to call these the gifts of growing older. I think she gives a different name to it. I'll put that on the screen now. I think she calls these the something conditions, special conditions of transformation. So again, The Grace in Aging, she gives a subtitle, Awaken as You Grow Older, sets out several of what she calls, again, these special conditions of transformation, which she calls skillful means by which we can organize our life around our intention. We're going to talk about intention, but the idea is that when we begin to have that pasada and samvega kind of thinking, we develop a very deep intention to use this life well. And that intention kind of formulates into a deeper commitment to our practice. If again, it's all around the topic of what we do with this life while we have the remainder of it. Here I will share a little bit of what she shares on this special conditions, kind of calling them this. Special conditions are actions we can impose upon the self, things that we can do with the self until we can be free of the self. I'm going to get to that topic eventually at the end. That's one of the gifts of growing older too, is the insight into who's aging, who is the self, what have you. But this is kind of what we can do with this self by imposing certain things on it that will give us the freedom and the ability to make this life more meaningful. Any gathering of spiritual practitioners from every tradition assembles a body of wisdom regarding how to till the soil. Remarkably similar conditions are engaged in all wisdom lineages. And even I say to some degree in many of the cultures that we have, many of the indigenous cultures had a very deep regard for what happens as their elders went through a process, and really respecting of what happens there that we've lost in our culture to some degree. We tend to shut off all the old people, put them in a home somewhere so we don't have to see that, be reminded of that. But they really embraced what the wisdom and the ability that their elders had to keep everything going, to be able to give some direction. Each of these special conditions is a powerful catalyst for transformation. They release us from grasping to self. Working skillfully, we can introduce and make use of these conditions in the midst of life, in these very chapters of being old. So I'll introduce you to these, and we'll talk a little bit about them. The first one, I combined two of hers. First one that she had was presence, I think, and then a little bit later she talked commitment. I think these two work really quite well together. presence and commitment that arise from having recognized some level of urgency and thus seeking the need to shift one's priorities towards awakening. It's kind of an extension of that Samvega and Pasada. But the idea is that we learn that we have to become much more present with our lives, that kind of sleeping at this time isn't the answer, right? To kind of check out. And this does happen with a lot of people who are aging, right? They sort of check out of life and they check out bit by bit and become more and more disengaged. And unfortunately, don't go into any sort of internal world that is meaningful. They just kind of lose an ability to kind of be active and do things that are kind of relevant to their life. So the need for presence is definitely something that we can acknowledge as we are growing older. And it's time to pay attention. Of course, we can pay attention throughout our whole life, but nonetheless, particularly when we are having this process of aging and becoming more cognizant of it. Also to become aware of the extent to which we have been distracted and to try to limit some of those distractions, to try to really focus the mind on what is most important. Try to make what we are going through as an aid to awakening and develop our deepest intention to kind of examine the old habits that we have, the things that we've been doing all of our life, and try to change some of those. If we go on into older age and die eventually with the same mindsets that we currently have or that we had earlier in our life, we know that those would not be so useful. We really want to do something so that we can change everything. One of the reasons why we have death awareness is so that when we get to death, we've got it all in order and we know exactly how we want to be, right? They actually say the mind at the time of death is one of the most important determining factors as to where you end up in your next life. Well, are we all ready for that? To what extent have we brought some presence to our awareness so that we make much more valid choices about what we do with our lives, where we put our attention, what sorts of thoughts we entertain, and what we really want to be committed to? Of course, in the Mahayana tradition, we have a commitment to the ideal of becoming a Buddha for the sake of all beings. That's a wonderful phrase, but nonetheless, it's lots of steps getting there. Holding that awareness is one thing, but what are we doing every moment to kind of further the progress on that path? I'll share one little quote from Kathleen Dowling Singh. She says, "Imagine what it would be like simply to be present with the mystery and the immensity and the glorious shimmering impermanence of this experience of life. Imagine what it would be like to live with a courageous heart, to not turn away, to stay open to what is difficult to face." When I read that quote earlier, I was thinking of somebody who I actually quoted when I was up in Shantideva Center in New York last weekend. I do a little talk on the environment, and I use some of her teachings in Active Hope, a wonderful woman named Joanna Macy, who some of you may have heard of. I think she's like 92, 93 years old now. And she's a staunch environmental activist and just continues to do the work. And she's looking at the tough stuff, right? She's not blinding herself and just checking out and saying, this world's going to hell in a handbasket, might as well just enjoy life, right? She's doing the work. She's Tibetan Buddhist as well. She has a very deep practice, from what I can tell in her readings, the things I've read of hers, and seeing her. You can watch her videos online. She's quite amazing. Joanna Macy. Yeah, the book that she wrote on the environment is called Active Hope. I actually brought it with me at one of the first Light of the Path, it was probably the second or third Light of the Path retreats, because I think it was published in 2011. So yeah, it was probably the third. Yeah, and did we do the third one in 2011? I can't remember. No, maybe not. I think it was 2009 and 2010. So maybe it wasn't until 2014. I think that was the next one after that. Yeah, but anyway, it's a wonderful book. She exemplifies that to me, kind of a courage to live one's life kind of open to all of it, open to the reality of what we're dealing with, refusing to kind of back down and sort of check out. That's what we mean by this concept of presence and commitment, kind of taking our intention, which comes out of those Samvega kind of mentality and the Pasada desire to actually open up to a commitment. This word commitment, it's a really interesting one. I remember one of the first times, it's a horrible joke for vegetarians, but they talked about how, like, if you have a breakfast of eggs and bacon, the chicken's involved in breakfast, but the pig is committed. So, I mean, it's kind of sad to think, but the pig's committed because it gave up its life to make that breakfast. Whereas the chicken just, it's an egg. Okay, I can make another one. And I think some of us get involved in Buddhism and maybe we see that, yeah, we like Buddhism and we're happy to give an egg, but are we really giving ourselves completely to it? Again, I don't know that we kind of went off the screen, but I think it was just something weird that happened. You did it? Oh, okay. Oh, okay, thank you. That's all right. That's quite all right. I should have taken it off of there. I apologize. Sometimes I forget what's all going on there, but. So again, what is commitment? What does commitment look like? Each of us has to go through this investigation. And as we're entering into our older years, as we're approaching that and being a part of that, what does it look like to be more committed? What can we let go of? What can we focus on? Again, we probably already did that at the lightning strikes moment to some degree, like I said earlier. Each of these stages is kind of a way of letting go of more of what has not really been working and not really getting us where we want to go and adopting more of what will get us where we want to go. This first step, I think, is so important to have this presence and commitment that we, again, these are things, these special conditions we do for ourselves, that we inflict on ourselves in a sense, so that we make the best use of this time. That we actually say, okay, I'm going to use the rest of the time I have with greater commitment and try to keep advancing that commitment, become more and more committed. Again, we might not have the vitality we had in our youth when perhaps that would have been quite useful to have with that degree of commitment, but use it now then, use whatever strength and energy you have to keep that commitment going. So let's try going on to the next one. I think that explains enough about what we mean by presence and commitment. The second one is simplicity that arises from withdrawing from life's busyness, narrowing one's activities, and letting go of self-imposed external measures of our lives. This one kind of goes hand in hand often with the first one, where we kind of recognize that we don't need to be involved in the busyness of life. We're kind of the older bee that can retire while all the drones are all doing all the stuff out there, but not retire in the sense of, again, just checking out and going to sleep. Saying, okay, I'm not going to get involved in that. I'm going to use this life for something else. I'm going to get rid of, again, some of the preoccupation with all of that and actually have a different way of looking at my life, that my life is no longer measured or dictated by all the other external things that I tended to measure my life. My occupation, all these. I know it's hard for a lot of people when they do retire, in quotes, and they kind of go into another phase of their life where they no longer are wearing the hat that they wore when they were working and so on, and things change in regard to that. That's a huge one. But there's a freedom that comes with that when you're withdrawing from that busyness. I like this idea of using a measure. A very dear student of mine up in Taos, he's in his 70, 78, I think he is now. And I think at 65 it was when he had a stroke. And he told me, he says he remembers when he was working with his doctor because his stroke had a pretty bad impact on his cognitive abilities. And he's managed to bounce back from that really, really well. And he said that his doctor told him, you need to have a new yardstick. Kind of like the way that you were measuring things has to be different, because if you continually hold the awareness of kind of wanting to be where you were before, that's not what we're talking about here. You change your measure in a sense. You kind of understand that you won't have all necessarily the energy that you had when you were younger. You won't have necessarily all the ability. You change your yardstick and you don't get bent out of shape about it, and you do what you can within that. Those measures or yardsticks are meant to be discarded over time, meant to be something that we can even just, forget it. Don't even have a yardstick at all at some point and think I'm just going to be content with where I'm at. This is a part of the simplicity, this withdrawal that we have. That again, when I say withdrawal from some society, I don't mean that we, check out completely. Some people may want to do deeper retreat and things like that. That's great. But nonetheless, this is a kind of withdrawal that happens by virtue of our making some decision about not to be preoccupied with the busyness of life. A third one is humility. Of course, all of those who've gone through some periods of aging and dealing with changes in our looks and all of that, we know that the pride that we had perhaps in our physique and how we looked and so on, We have to embrace a much more humble stance because all of that goes away. This arises from discerning the futility of superiority and arrogance, as well as the advantages of letting go of the illusion of perfectionism and releasing into ordinariness. I like this. These words kind of, if you hear them when you're like a teenager, you might think, well, what are you talking about? I don't want to be ordinary, right? You want to be something extraordinary. The idea is that all of those things, again, that trap that we have of being too prideful around our appearance and who we are, our status, all these things, they sort of go away, and we rest in the contentment of being a just ordinary person. We don't have to invest in all of that anymore. Humility here is meant to be just a real understanding that all of that, again, it just doesn't get you anywhere. Just doesn't produce what you really want it to be if you just continue to hold on to all of that. We often talk about pride, the opposite of humility, as being one of our greatest obstacles on the path. Because if we think more of ourselves than we actually are, well, then we're not taking the opportunity to grow and develop. And if we, of course, have that prideful attitude towards others, then we don't take advantage of what they can teach us, what we can learn from them. So humility is the best stance throughout our lives. We have that wonderful verse from the 8 verses, right? When in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest among all, and respectfully hold others dear and supreme from the depths of my heart. And the ego doesn't want to hear that, right? We want to think of ourselves as the best among all, and it's all about us, and you all need to pay attention to me. Well, when we really approach this topic of humility, and if we can implement it in our lives, we're much more content because we don't get caught up in that trap of pride. We don't get caught up in everything that is entailed in it. Kind of going through these a little quickly because we are getting to the end of our time, unfortunately. I put gratitude and generosity together. I think she talks about these real peripherally, but Dowling Singh doesn't really go into them in great detail. I call this even generosity of spirit. We're going to talk about gratitude more on Sunday. I've chosen this as the topic, or was actually chosen as one of the topics for me to teach on, and we've chosen it now for the Sunday Dharma talk that I'll be here for this weekend. So I'm not going to talk so much about it, but we know that gratitude is easy to generate in some ways because there's always things to be grateful for. We just forget to do it and don't have that impulse to practice gratitude. So we'll go into that more on Sunday, how we adopt an attitude of gratitude. Generosity of spirit is the idea that we bring to our lives and those that we interact with a real sense of giving of ourselves and wanting to be involved with the lives of others. At this phase of our lives, we're looking at old age, is often when many people, once they've retired, do find that they're in a better position to give of themselves in a very real way by volunteering and being of service to others. If that can be part of your spiritual path, it's a wonderful practice, right? Giving to the center, being involved in Kadampa center and helping out with things, being an extra person for this and that, helping out friends who are ill or dealing with difficulty. You may be on the receiving end of that at some point, but we appreciate our blessings and good fortune, and we want to reciprocate. And it's when we're in those older years when perhaps we have a bit more time that we can actually have that generosity of both the material things and time that we have, as well as to give of ourselves, to really be an influence to others. I had a wonderful program going on in the Santa Fe schools for a while where the older folks, we had a lot of retired people in Santa Fe, would go into the public schools during the lunch hours, the recesses and stuff, and kind of be there to help with overseeing things with the younger kids. It's kind of a nice way for them to be of service. Forgiveness and reconciliation that arise from seeing the weight of holding on to past resentments and opening to taking responsibility for healing and restoring harmony in our relationships. If we haven't done that work of healing over whatever divisions we might have with people in our lives, family members, friends, what have you, do that by all means. That's a wonderful opportunity and extension of our spiritual practice. While I was at Shantideva Center, I did my little one-day workshop on forgiveness. It's kind of interesting. Forgiveness isn't really technically a Buddhist concept. They don't really even use the word forgiveness in any of the Buddhist sutras. It's not, and it does tend to be a little bit more grounded in theistic traditions. But nonetheless, it's a concept that fits very nicely into teachings on compassion and understanding the detriments of holding on to resentment to other people and wanting to let all of that go. Certainly by the time we get to death, it's important that we have let go of any of these kind of harms from the past that we have not absolved others of, not forgiven them, and also to seek apology for the things that we have done. And then, reconcile as best as we can. There are maybe some people we can't reconcile with, but I think we can see that as a spiritual practice, to actually be able to, through humility, be the person who is going to say, yes, I forgive you, whatever people have done. And, just be the person who is stepping forward with that attitude. The last one that I want to share is insight. I mentioned earlier that we're going to talk about this concept of like what she said, this is what we do with the self while we're waiting to abandon the self. This false sense of self that is kind of at the center of all of it. Insight that arises from having embraced solitude and silence and then opening to investigating the true nature of reality, of the self. You don't have much time to talk about it. I'll just say a little, but this is actually kind of main topic of this weekend, right? When we're going to look at dependent arising, this wonderful praise that Lama Tsongkhapa gave to praise this teaching that helps us to see selflessness, emptiness. But here we're talking about this fictitious sense of self that all of this has revolved around. This whole life you've been attached to this sense of self that is fictional. I mean, there is a self that is kind of there designated, that is just merely imputed, but we've overlaid so much stuff on top of it that is totally unreal, not there at all. And as we age, we can begin to see, perhaps through the process of aging, that starts to fall away to some degree. Not that it naturally becomes like an insight into emptiness. We have to do the additional work as well. But there's less of a grasping at that sense of self to some degree through some of the other factors we already looked at, these other special conditions or, gifts of growing older. Humility very much reduces the sense of I that we're grasping to in such a prideful manner. And, the sense of forgiving and what have you, where we're willing to be the person who lets go of all of that. Whatever harms that we've experienced, they're irrelevant now. We can let them go. We can shed ourselves of that. And even the strong attachment to this sense of identity that we have, that we've clung to for so long, like it's a life raft in the middle of the ocean. You can finally let go of it and you're not going to drown. You're simply going to be free of all of it. So this is the idea that as we age, and I might share even one or two quotes from her wonderful book on the grace in aging about this, because I think it's really quite nice. She says, it is kind and wise to question ourselves, to inquire, what am I doing to protect myself from life? What do I believe about me? What do I believe about my ability to control? Who am I if I don't get what I want? Who am I if the objects of my attachment disappear? Who am I without the labels? Who am I without the stories, now decades old? Who am I without the explanations and justifications so often repeated? Who am I without the habits? Who am I without the fears? Our work is in solitude. It's done with exquisite tenderness and profound openness. That tenderness is based on our own growing confidence, again, that pasada, the maturity of practice that allows us to remain increasingly non-judgmental, to rest more frequently in the state of always already complete perfection. And not the perfection that we had as some ideal, but we're already there. We can be perfect in the moment. We can just be with the moment. And again, try to shed some of that strong sense of self that we're so attached to. We can begin to see it, she says, as the illusion that it is. We can begin to see it as the prison that it is. We can let go of our attachment to it, recognizing that it is incapable of orchestrating the happiness we seek. I mean, that's a pretty heavy use of aging, but that's the big one, right? That's the one that we eventually need to get to. Now, again, will we get there? Well, let's hope we all do and use that time for deep reflection, in solitude to some degree, in silence to some degree. I know a lot of people think, as I get older and when I retire, I want to do more retreat. It's a wonderful aspiration. Try to do retreat when you can, simply because there's no guarantee that we're all going to reach that age. But that is a good time to do retreat, to actually say, okay, we've got aging members of the FPMT community, right, that are in retreat in Crestone, Colorado, and places, that are trying to make good use of this time of their lives, to actually do the work. You know, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, it's very sad that he's no longer with us, but he gave us everything we need, really, you know. He gave us the incredible gift of the Dharma that we now have, that we can practice within this understanding of the fact of aging, within the understanding of the fact of impermanence. This was one of the main things we were all advised to do after Rinpoche passed away, right? Meditate on impermanence and bodhicitta. You know, two of the most important things that really get the fire under our butt by seeing impermanence through the guise of aging, illness, death, and so on. And then also recognizing our commitment to this path and how much we need to cultivate bodhicitta with everything that we do. So folks, we got it, you know, we have what we need to make good use of this life. It's just up to us to do that. So I hope this has been useful. I want to share one little thing as kind of a closing. This was actually a wonderful little prayer that I believe is from Lewis Richmond's book that is really quite sweet. It's called A Prayer for the Passing Away of Things. As everything, we can say this together, as everything ages and passes away, may each of us be kind to ourselves. As everything ages and passes away, may each of us accept joy and sorrow. As everything ages and passes away, may each of us be happy and at peace. And may we eventually find true peace and find enlightenment for the sake of all beings. So let me see if there are any questions. I don't have a lot of time because, again, we've gone over already. I don't know how much you want to go over, but are there any questions from folks on the Zoom, YouTube, in the Gompa?
Again, if you're online, if you're on YouTube, you can put it in the chat. If you're on Zoom, just raise your hand. If you're in here, just ask for the microphone.
I mean, I can say that I do encourage these, especially the two books that I mentioned that are specifically about aging. If you were, I think Lewis Richmond wrote a follow-up book that I've read part of that's more geared at men and aging, because he does, from his insight in working with men, think men have a lot more difficulty with aging than women do. I don't know if that's true or not, but he says there are different issues for men too because of habitual roles that men tend to play in society that they no longer can. And so again, I don't know. That's one thing for those of you who identify as male to, maybe take a look at. So it doesn't look like there are any questions or comments, so that's fine. So again, tomorrow night, I'm glad to be back with you all again for an interesting topic as well, called faith in Buddhism, kind of what that's all about. I'm finding it interesting, even up in New York, they chose topics that do have kind of some similar threads running through them. And here too, I think I can say that to some degree, these all do have some things that touch on each other, that complement each other. That's the wonderful thing about the Dharma, perhaps. But nonetheless, I'm very happy to be back here and looking forward to those. Let's go ahead and just do a couple of dedication prayers at the end. Linda will get those up on the screen. And then we will, sure, let's do Shantideva's prayer. Many of you know this prayer. It's really one of the most wonderful dedication prayers and His Holiness's favorite dedication verses. And as we do this, we can think about beings being free from all the various temporal sufferings that are being talked about here, as well as free from everything that is unsatisfactory, eventually free from aging, illness, death, and attaining the greatest state of enlightenment through our recitation of these words together. May all...
Page 32
oh, sorry.
in the gold prayer book.
Sorry. Are we there? May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn and hope constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may these never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Let's dedicate also for the good health and long lives of our precious gurus, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he's aging wonderfully in front of all of us, right? We have that example of somebody who maintains their dedication to the Dharma and their practice while the body is going through that process of aging. Then let's also dedicate for the very swift return of Kyabji Zopa Rinpoche so that we may be graced with his presence in this world once again to guide us and others on our path to awakening. And then, of course, all of our other teachers with whom we have a karmic connection. And lastly, dedicate for those beings who you know in your life or who you've heard of, or situations in the world, such as those in Morocco now after this horrible earthquake, and still dealing with the fire aftermath in Maui and so many other places. Wherever it is that your heart is moved to go to, just bring your awareness of those people and places who are experiencing suffering. And dedicate this merit for their welfare, just as we did with those verses. May they no longer have those sufferings. May they find freedom from them and a perfect path that leads them to complete happiness and well-being. And may this happen for all beings through what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all. I enjoyed this very much, being with you tonight, and I'll look forward to tomorrow night and the weekend. So, all right. Thank you all for being online and on YouTube. Be well. See you all soon.
Good night, everyone. We'll see you hopefully tomorrow night for Faith in the Buddhist